Chapter 51, Part 7 of the History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon, Volume 5, Chapter 51, Part 7. I should deceive the expectation of the reader if I passed in silence the fate of the Alexandrian library, as it is described by the learned Abulpharagius. The spirit of Amrou was more curious and liberal than that of his brethren, and in his leisure hours the Arabian chief was pleased with the conversation of John, the last disciple of Ammonius, who derived the surname of Philoponus from his laborious studies of grammar and philosophy. Emboldened by this familiar intercourse, Philoponus presumed to solicit a gift, inestimable in his opinion, contemptible in that of the barbarians, the royal library, which alone among the spoils of Alexandria had not been appropriated by the visit and the seal of the conqueror. Amrou was inclined to gratify the wish of the grammarian, but his rigid integrity refused to alienate the minutest object without the consent of the caliph, and the well-known answer of Omar was inspired by the ignorance of a fanatic. If these writings of the Greeks agree with the book of God, they are useless, and need not be preserved; if they disagree, they are pernicious, and ought to be destroyed. The sentence was executed with blind obedience; the volumes of paper or parchment were distributed to the 4,000 baths of the city, and such was their incredible multitude, that 6 months were barely sufficient for the consumption of this precious fuel. Since the dynasties of Abulpharagius have been given to the world in a Latin verse, the tale has been repeatedly transcribed, and every scholar, with pious indignation, has deplored the irreparable shipwreck of the learning, the arts, and the genius of antiquity. For my own part, I am strongly tempted to deny both the fact and the consequences. The fact is indeed marvellous. "Read and wonder," says the historian himself, and the solitary report of a stranger who wrote at the end of 600 years on the confines of Media is overbalanced by the silence of 2 annalists of a more early date, both Christians, both natives of Egypt, and the most ancient of whom, the patriarch Eutychius, has amply described the conquest of Alexandria. The rigid sentence of Omar is repugnant to the sound and orthodox precept of the Mohammedan casuists. They expressly declare, that the religious books of the Jews and Christians, which are acquired by the right of war, should never be committed to the flames; and that the works of profane science, historians or poets, physicians or philosophers, may be lawfully applied to the use of the faithful. A more destructive zeal may perhaps be attributed to the first successors of Mahomet; yet in this instance, the conflagration would have speedily expired in the deficiency of materials. I should not recapitulate the disasters of the Alexandrian library, the involuntary flame that was kindled by Caesar in his own defense, or the mischievous bigotry of the Christians, who studied to destroy the monuments of idolatry. But if we gradually descend from the age of the Antonines to that of Theodosius, we shall learn from a chain of contemporary witnesses, that the royal palace and the temple of Serapis no longer contained the 4 or the 700,000 volumes which had been assembled by the curiosity and magnificence of the Ptolemies. Perhaps the church and seat of the patriarchs might be enriched with a repository of books; but if the ponderous mass of Arian and Monophysite controversy were indeed consumed in the public baths, a philosopher may allow, with a smile, that it was ultimately devoted to the benefit of mankind. I sincerely regret the more valuable libraries which have been involved in the ruin of the Roman Empire; but when I seriously compute the lapse of ages, the waste of ignorance, and the calamities of war, our treasures, rather than our losses, are the objects of my surprise. Many curious and interesting facts are buried in oblivion; the 3 great historians of Rome have been transmitted to our hands in a mutilated state, and we are deprived of many pleasing compositions of the lyric, iambic, and dramatic poetry of the Greeks. Yet we should gratefully remember, that the mischances of time and accident have spared the classic works to which the suffrage of antiquity had adjudged the first place of genius and glory. The teachers of ancient knowledge, who are still extant, had perused and compared the writings of their predecessors; nor can it fairly be presumed that any important truth, any useful discovery in art or nature, has been snatched away from the curiosity of modern ages. In the administration of Egypt, Amrou balanced the demands of justice and policy, the interests of the people of the law, who were defended by God, and of the people of the alliance, who were protected by man. In the recent tumult of conquest and deliverance, the tongue of the Copts and the sword of the Arabs were most adverse to the tranquillity of the province. To the former, Amrou declared that faction and falsehood would be doubly chastised, by the punishment of the accusers, whom he should detest as his personal enemies, and by the promotion of their innocent brethren, whom their envy had laboured to injure and supplant. He excited the latter by the motives of religion and honour to sustain the dignity of their character, to endear themselves by a modest and temperate conduct to God and the Caliph, to spare and protect a people who had trusted to their faith, and to content themselves with the legitimate and splendid rewards of their victory. In the management of the revenue, he disapproved the simple but oppressive mode of a capitulation, and preferred with reason a proportion of taxes deducted on every branch from the clear profits of agriculture and commerce. A third part of the tribute was appropriated to the annual repairs of the dykes and canals, so essential to the public welfare. Under his administration, the fertility of Egypt supplied the dearth of Arabia, and a string of camels, laden with corn and provisions, covered almost without an interval the long road from Memphis to Medina. But the genius of Amrou soon renewed the maritime communication which had been attempted or achieved by the Pharaohs, the Ptolemies, or the Caesars, and a canal, at least 80 miles in length, was opened from the Nile to the Red Sea. This inland navigation, which would have joined the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean, was soon discontinued as useless and dangerous; the throne was removed from Medina to Damascus, and the Grecian fleets might have explored a passage to the holy cities of Arabia. Of his new conquest, the Caliph Omar had an imperfect knowledge from the voice of fame and the legends of the Koran. He requested that his lieutenant would place before his eyes the realm of Pharaoh and the Amalekites, and the answer of Amrou exhibits a lively and not unfaithful picture of that singular country. O Commander of the Faithful! Egypt is a compound of black earth and green plants, between a pulverized mountain and a red sand. The distance from Syene to the sea is a month's journey for a horseman. Along the valley descends a river, on which the blessing of the Most High reposes both in the evening and morning, and which rises and falls with the revolutions of the sun and moon. When the annual dispensation of Providence unlocks the springs and fountains that nourish the earth, the Nile rolls his swelling and sounding waters through the realm of Egypt, the fields are overspread by the salutary flood, and the villages communicate with each other in their painted barks. The retreat of the inundation deposits a fertilizing mud for the reception of the various seeds. The crowds of husbandmen who blacken the land may be compared to a swarm of industrious ants, and their native indolence is quickened by the lash of the taskmaster, and the promise of the flowers and fruits of a plentiful increase. Their hope is seldom deceived, but the riches which they extract from the wheat, the barley, and the rice, the legumes, the fruit trees, and the cattle, are unequally shared between those who labour and those who possess. According to the vicissitudes of the seasons, the face of the country is adorned with a silver wave, a verdant emerald, and the deep yellow of a golden harvest. Yet this beneficial order is sometimes interrupted, and the long delay and sudden swell of the river in the first year of the conquest might afford some colour to an edifying fable. It is said that the annual sacrifice of a virgin had been interdicted by the piety of Omar, and that the Nile lay sullen and inactive in his shallow bed, till the mandate of the Caliph was cast into the obedient stream, which rose in a single night to the height of 16 cubits. The admiration of the Arabs for their new conquest encouraged the license of their romantic spirit. We may read, in the gravest authors, that Egypt was crowded with 20,000 cities or villages; that, exclusive of the Greeks and Arabs, the Copts alone were found, on the assessment, 6 millions of tributary subjects, or 20 millions of either sex, and of every age; that 300 millions of gold and silver were annually paid to the treasury of the Caliphs. Our reason must be startled by these extravagant assertions, and they will become more palpable, if we assume the compass and measure of the extent of habitable ground, a valley from the tropic to Memphis seldom broader than 12 miles, and the triangle of the Delta, a flat surface of 2,100 square leagues, compose a 12th part of the magnitude of France. A more accurate research will justify a more reasonable estimate. The 300 millions, created by the era of a scribe, are reduced to the decent revenue of 4,300,000 pieces of gold, of which 900,000 were consumed by the pay of the soldiers. Two authentic lists, of the present and of the 12th century, are circumscribed within the respectable number of 2,700 villages and towns. After a long residence at Cairo, a French council has ventured to assign about 4 millions of Mohammedans, Christians, and Jews, for the ample, though not incredible, scope of the population of Egypt. The conquest of Africa, from the Nile to the Atlantic Ocean, was first attempted by the arms of the Caliph Othman. The pious design was approved by the companions of Mohammed and the chiefs of the tribes, and 20,000 Arabs marched from Medina, with gifts and the blessings of the commander of the faithful. They were joined in the camp of Memphis by 20,000 of their countrymen, and the conduct of the war was entrusted to Abdallah, the son of Said and the foster brother of the Caliph, who had lately supplanted the conqueror and lieutenant of Egypt. Yet the favour of the prince, and the merit of his favourite, could not obliterate the guilt of his apostasy. The early conversion of Abdallah, and his skilful pen, had recommended him to the important office of transcribing the sheets of the Koran. He betrayed his trust, corrupted the text, derided the errors which he had made, and fled to Mecca to escape the justice, and expose the ignorance of the apostle. After the conquest of Mecca, he fell prostrate at the feet of Mohammed. His tears and the entreaties of Othman extorted a reluctant pardon, but the Prophet declared that he had so long hesitated to allow time for some zealous disciple to avenge his injury in the blood of the apostate. With apparent fidelity and effective merit, he served the religion which it was no longer his interest to desert. His birth and talents gave him an honourable rank among the Koreish, and in a nation of cavalry, Abdallah was renowned as the boldest and most dexterous horseman of Arabia. At the head of 40,000 Moslems, he advanced from Egypt into the unknown countries of the West. The sands of Barca might be impervious to a Roman legion, but the Arabs were attended by their faithful camels, and the natives of the desert beheld without terror the familiar aspect of the soil and climate. After a painful march, they pitched their tents before the walls of Tripoli, a maritime city in which the name, the wealth, and the inhabitants of the province had gradually centred, and which now maintains the third rank among the states of Barbary. A reinforcement of Greeks was surprised and cut in pieces on the seashore, but the fortifications of Tripoli resisted the first assaults, and the Saracens were tempted by the approach of the prefect Gregory to relinquish the labours of the siege for the perils and the hopes of a decisive action. If his standard was followed by 120,000 men, the regular bands of the empire must have been lost in the naked and disorderly crowd of Africans and Moors, who formed the strength, or rather the numbers, of his host. He rejected with indignation the option of the Koran or the tribute, and during several days the two armies were fiercely engaged from the dawn of light to the hour of noon, when their fatigue and the excessive heat compelled them to seek shelter and refreshment in their respective camps. The daughter of Gregory, a maid of incomparable beauty and spirit, is said to have fought by his side. From her earliest youth she was trained to mount on horseback, to draw the bow, and to wield the scimitar, and the richness of her arms and apparel were conspicuous in the foremost ranks of the battle. Her hand, with 100,000 pieces of gold, was offered for the head of the Arabian general, and the youths of Africa were excited by the prospect of the glorious prize. At the pressing solicitation of his brethren, Abdallah withdrew his person from the field, but the Saracens were discouraged by the retreat of their leader, and the repetition of those equal or unsuccessful conflicts. A noble Arabian, who afterwards became the adversary of Ali, and the father of a caliph, had signalized his valour in Egypt, and Zobeir was the first who planted the scaling ladder against the walls of Babylon. In the African war he was detached from the standard of Abdallah. In the news of the battle, Zobeir, with 12 companions, cut his way through the camp of the Greeks, and pressed forwards, without tasting either food or repose, to partake of the danger of his brethren. He cast his eyes round the field. "Where," said he, "is our general?" "In his tent." "Is the tent a station for the general of the Moslems?" Abdallah represented with a blush the importance of his own life, and the temptation that was held forth by the Roman prefect. "Retort," said Zobeir, "on the infidels and their ungenerous attempt. Proclaim through the ranks that the head of Gregory shall be repaid with his captive daughter, and the equal sum of 100,000 pieces of gold." To the courage and discretion of Zobeir the lieutenant of the caliph entrusted the execution of his own stratagem, which included the long disputed balance in favour of the Saracens. Supplying by activity and artifice the deficiency of numbers, a part of their forces lay concealed in their tents, while the remainder prolonged an irregular skirmish with the enemy till the sun was high in the heavens. On both sides they retired with fainting steps; their horses were unbridled, their armour was laid aside, and the hostile nations prepared, or seemed to prepare, for the refreshment of the evening, and the encounter of the ensuing day. On a sudden, the charge was sounded, the Arabian camp poured forth a swarm of fresh and intrepid warriors, and the long line of the Greeks and Africans was surprised, assaulted, overturned, by new squadrons of the faithful, who, to the eye of fanaticism, might appear as a band of angels descending from the sky. The prefect himself was slain by the hand of Zobeir; his daughter, who sought revenge in death, was surrounded and made prisoner, and the fugitives involved in their disaster the town of Sufetula, to which they escaped from the sabres and lances of the Arabs. Sufetula was built 150 miles to the south of Carthage; a gentle declivity is watered by a running stream, and shaded by a grove of juniper trees, and in the ruins of a triumphal arch, a portico, and 3 temples of the Corinthian order, curiosity may yet admire the magnificence of the Romans. After the fall of this opulent city, the provincials and barbarians implored on all sides the mercy of the conqueror. His vanity or his zeal might be flattered by offers of tribute or professions of faith; but his losses, his fatigues, and the progress of an epidemical disease, prevented a solid establishment, and the Saracens, after a campaign of 15 months, retreated to the confines of Egypt, with the captives and the wealth of their African expedition. The Caliph's fifth was granted to a favourite, on the nominal payment of 500,000 pieces of gold; but the state was doubly injured by this fallacious transaction, if each foot soldier had shared 1,000, and each horseman 3,000 pieces, in the real division of the plunder. The author of the death of Gregory was expected to have claimed the most precious reward of the victory; from his silence it might be presumed that he had fallen in the battle, till the tears and exclamations of the prefect's daughter at the sight of Zobeir revealed the valour and modesty of that gallant soldier. The unfortunate virgin was offered, and almost rejected as a slave, by her father's murderer, who coolly declared that his sword was consecrated to the service of religion, and that he laboured for a recompense far above the charms of mortal beauty, or the riches of this transitory life. A reward congenial to his temper was the honourable commission of announcing to the Caliph Othman the success of his arms. The companions, the chiefs, and the people were assembled in the mosque of Medina, to hear the interesting narrative of Zobeir, and as the orator forgot nothing except the merit of his own counsels and actions, the name of Abdallah was joined by the Arabians with the heroic names of Khalid and Amro. Chapter 51.
Part 8 of the History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by M.B. Chapter 51. Conquests by the Arabs, Part 8. The western conquests of the Saracens were suspended near 20 years, till their dissensions were composed by the establishment of the house of Ommeyah, and the Caliph Moawiyah was invited by the cries of the Africans themselves. The successors of Heraclius had been informed of the tribute which they had been compelled to stipulate with the Arabs, but instead of being moved to pity and relieve their distress, they imposed, as an equivalent or a fine, a second tribute of a similar amount. The ears of the Byzantine ministers were shut against the complaints of their poverty and ruin. Their despair was reduced to prefer the dominion of a single master; and the extortions of the patriarch of Carthage, who was invested with civil and military power, provoked the sectaries, and even the Catholics of the Roman province, to abjure the religion as well as the authority of their tyrants. The first lieutenant of Moawiyah acquired a just renown, subdued an important city, defeated an army of 30,000 Greeks, swept away 80,000 captives, and enriched with their spoils the bold adventures of Syria and Egypt. But the title of conqueror of Africa is more justly due to his successor Akbar. He marched from Damascus at the head of 10,000 of the bravest Arabs, and the genuine force of the Moslems was enlarged by the doubtful aid and conversion of many thousand barbarians. It would be difficult, nor is it necessary, to trace the accurate line of the progress of Akba. The interior regions have been peopled by the Orientals with fictitious armies and imaginary citadels. In the warlike province of Zab, or Numidia, 80,000 of the natives might assemble in arms, but the number of 360 towns is incompatible with the ignorance or decay of husbandry, and a circumference of 3 leagues will not be justified by the ruins of Urbi or Lambesa, the ancient metropolis of that inland country. As we approach the sea coast, the well-known cities of Bujia and Tangier define the more certain limits of the Saracen victories. A remnant of trade still adheres to the commodious harbour of Bujia, which, in a more prosperous age, is said to have contained about 20,000 homes, and the plenty of iron which is dug from the adjacent mountains might have supplied a braver people with the instruments of defence. The remote position and venerable antiquity of Tingi or Tangier have been decorated by the Greek and Arabian fables, but the figurative expressions of the latter, that the walls were constructed of brass, and that the roofs were covered with gold and silver, may be interpreted as the emblems of strength and opulence. The provinces of Mauritania Tingitana, which assumed the name of the capital, had been imperfectly discovered and settled by the Romans. The 5 colonies were confined to a narrow pale, and the more southern parts were seldom explored except by the agents of luxury, who searched the forest for ivory and the citron wood, and the shores of the ocean for the purple shellfish. The fearless Akba plunged into the heart of the country, traversed the wilderness in which his successors erected the splendid capitals of Fez and Morocco, and at length penetrated to the verge of the Atlantic and the Great Desert. The river Sus descends from the western sides of Mount Atlas, fertilizes, like the Nile, the adjacent soil, and falls into the sea at a moderate distance from the Canary or Fortunate Islands. Its banks were inhabited by the last of the Moors, a race of savages without laws or discipline or religion, and they were astonished by the strange and irresistible terror of the Oriental arms; and as they possessed neither gold nor silver, the richest spoil was the beauty of the female captives, some of whom were afterwards sold for 1,000 pieces of gold. The career, though not the zeal, of Akba was checked by the prospect of a boundless ocean. He spurred his horse into the waves, and raising his eyes to heaven, exclaimed with the tone of a fanatic, "Great God! If my course were not stopped by this sea, I would still go on to the unknown kingdoms of the West, preaching the unity of thy holy name, and putting to the sword the rebellious nations who worship any other gods than thee." Yet this Mohammedan Alexander, who sighed for new worlds, was unable to preserve his recent conquests. By the universal defection of the Greeks and Africans he was recalled from the shores of the Atlantic, and the surrounding multitudes left him only the resource of an honorable death. The last scene was dignified by an example of national virtue. An ambitious chief, who had disputed the command and failed in the attempt, was led about as a prisoner in the camp of the Arabian general. The insurgents had trusted to his discontent and revenge. He disdained their offers and revealed their designs. In the hour of danger, the grateful Akba unlocked his fetters and advised him to retire. He chose to die under the banner of his rival. Embracing as friends and martyrs, they unsheathed their scimitars, broke their scabbards, and maintained an obstinate combat till they fell by each other's side on the last of their slaughtered countrymen. The third general or governor of Africa, Suhir, avenged and encountered the fate of his predecessor. He vanquished the natives in many battles. He was overthrown by a powerful army, which Constantinople had sent to the relief of Carthage. It had been the frequent practice of the Moorish tribes to join the invaders, to share the plunder, to profess the faith, and to revolt to their savage state of independence and idolatry, on the first retreat or misfortune of the Moslems. The prudence of Akba had proposed to found an Arabian colony in the heart of Africa, a citadel that might curb the levity of the barbarians, a place of refuge to secure, against the accidents of war, the wealth and the families of the Saracens. With this view, and under the modest title of the station of a caravan, he planted this colony in the 50th year of the Hegira. In the present day, Kairouan still holds the second rank in the kingdom of Tunis, from which it is now distant about 50 miles to the south. Its inland situation, 12 miles westward of the sea, has protected the city from the Greek and Sicilian fleets. When the wild beasts and serpents were extirpated, when the forest, or rather wilderness, was cleared, the vestiges of a Roman town were discovered in a sandy plain. The vegetable food of Kairouan is brought in from afar, and the scarcity of springs constrains the inhabitants to collect in cisterns and reservoirs a precious supply of rainwater. These obstacles were subdued by the industry of Akba. He traced a circumference of 3,600 paces, which he encompassed with a brick wall. In the space of 5 years the governor's palace was surrounded with a sufficient number of private habitations. A spacious mosque was supported by 500 columns of granite, porphyry, and Numidian marble, and Kairouan became the seat of learning as well as of empire. But these were the glories of a later age. The new colony was shaken by the successive defeats of Akba and Zuhair, and the western expeditions were again interrupted by the civil discord of the Arabian monarchy. The son of the valiant Zobeir maintained a war of 12 years, a siege of 7 months against the house of Ommeyah. Abdallah was said to unite the fierceness of the lion with the subtlety of the fox, but if he inherited the courage, he was devoid of the generosity of his father. The return of domestic peace allowed the Caliph Abd al-Malik to resume the conquest of Africa. The standard was delivered to Hassan, governor of Egypt, and the revenue of that kingdom, with an army of 40,000 men, was consecrated to the important service. In the vicissitudes of war, the interior provinces had been alternately won and lost by the Saracens. But the sea coast still remained in the hands of the Greeks. The predecessors of Hassan had respected the name and fortifications of Carthage, and the number of its defenders was recruited by the fugitives of Cabes and Tripoli. The arms of Hassan were bolder and more fortunate. He reduced and pillaged the metropolis of Africa, and the mention of scaling ladders may justify the suspicion that he anticipated, by a sudden assault, the more tedious operations of a regular siege. But the joy of the conquerors was soon disturbed by the appearance of the Christian succors. The prefect and patrician John, a general of experience and renown, embarked at Constantinople the forces of the Eastern Empire. They were joined by the ships and soldiers of Sicily, and a powerful reinforcement of Goths was obtained from the fears and religion of the Spanish monarch. The weight of the Confederate navy broke the chain that guarded the entrance of the harbor. The Arabs retired to Kairouan or Tripoli. The Christians landed. The citizens hailed the ensign of the cross, and the winter was idly wasted in the dream of victory or deliverance. But Africa was irrecoverably lost. The zeal and resentment of the commander of the faithful prepared in the ensuing spring a more numerous armament by sea and land, and the patrician, in his turn, was compelled to evacuate the post and fortifications of Carthage. A second battle was fought in the neighborhood of Utica. The Greeks and Goths were again defeated, and their timely embarkation saved them from the sword of Hassan, who had invested the slight and insufficient rampart of their camp. Whatever yet remained of Carthage was delivered to the flames, and the colony of Dido and Caesar lay desolate above 200 years, till a part, perhaps a 20th, of the old circumference was repeopled by the first of the Fatimite caliphs. In the beginning of the 16th century, the second capital of the West was represented by a mosque, a college without students, 25 or 30 shops, and the huts of 500 peasants, who, in their abject poverty, displayed the arrogance of Punic senators. Even that paltry village was swept away by the Spaniards whom Charles V had stationed in the fortress of the Goletta. The ruins of Carthage have perished, and the place might be unknown, if some broken arches of an aqueduct did not guide the footsteps of the inquisitive traveller. The Greeks were expelled, but the Arabians were not yet masters of the country. In the interior provinces the Moors or Berbers, so feeble under the first Caesars, so formidable to the Byzantine princes, maintained a disorderly resistance to the religion and power of the successors of Mahomet. Under the standard of their queen Kahina, the independent tribes acquired some degree of union and discipline; and as the Moors respected in their females the character of a prophetess, they attacked the invaders with an enthusiasm similar to their own. The veteran bands of Hassan were inadequate to the defence of Africa. The conquests of an age were lost in a single day, and the Arabian chief, overwhelmed by the torrent, retired to the confines of Egypt, and expected 5 years the promised succours of the Caliph. After the retreat of the Saracens, the victorious prophetess assembled the Moorish chiefs, and recommended a measure of strange and savage policy. "Our cities," said she, "and the gold and silver which they contain, perpetually attract the arms of the Arabs. These vile metals are not the objects of our ambition. We content ourselves with the simple productions of the earth. Let us destroy these cities. Let us bury in their ruins those pernicious treasures, and when the avarice of our foes shall be destitute of temptation, perhaps they will cease to disturb the tranquillity of a warlike people." The proposal was accepted with unanimous applause. From Tangier to Tripoli, the buildings, or at least the fortifications, were demolished, the fruit trees were cut down, the means of subsistence were extirpated, a fertile and populous garden was changed into a desert, and the historians of a more recent period could discern the frequent traces of the prosperity and devastation of their ancestors. Such is the tale of the modern Arabians. Yet I strongly suspect that their ignorance of antiquity, the love of the marvellous, and the fashion of extolling the philosophy of barbarians, has induced them to describe, as one voluntary act, the calamities of 300 years since the first fury of the Donatists and Vandals. In the progress of the revolt, Kahina had most probably contributed her share of destruction, and the alarm of universal ruin might terrify and alienate the cities that had reluctantly yielded to her unworthy yoke. They no longer hoped, perhaps they no longer wished, the return of their Byzantine sovereigns. Their present servitude was not alleviated by the benefits of order and justice, and the most zealous Catholic must prefer the imperfect truths of the Koran to the blind and rude idolatry of the Moors. The general of the Saracens was again received as the saviour of the province. The friends of civil society conspired against the savages of the land, and the royal prophetess was slain in the first battle which overturned the baseless fabric of her superstition and empire. The same spirit revived under the successor of Hassan. It was finally quelled by the activity of Musa and his 2 sons, but the number of the rebels may be presumed from that of 300,000 captives, 60,000 of whom, the Caliph's fifth, were sold for the profit of the public treasury. 30,000 of the barbarian youth were enlisted in the troops, and the pious labours of Musa, to inculcate the knowledge and practice of the Koran, accustomed the Africans to obey the apostle of God and the commander of the faithful. In their climate and government, their diet and habitation, the wandering Moors resembled the Bedouins of the desert. With the religion they were proud to adopt the language, name, and origin of Arabs. The blood of the strangers and natives was insensibly mingled, and from the Euphrates to the Atlantic the same nation might seem to be diffused over the sandy plains of Asia and Africa. Yet I will not deny that 50,000 tents of pure Arabians might be transported over the Nile, and scattered through the Libyan desert, and I am not ignorant that 5 of the Moorish tribes still retain their barbarous idiom with the appellation and character of white Africans. In the progress of conquest from the north and south, the Goths and the Saracens encountered each other on the confines of Europe and Africa. In the opinion of the latter, the difference of religion is a reasonable ground of enmity and warfare. As early as the time of Othman, their piratical squadrons had ravaged the coast of Andalusia, nor had they forgotten the relief of Carthage by the Gothic succors. In that age, as well as in the present, the kings of Spain were possessed of the fortress of Ceuta, one of the columns of Hercules, which is divided by a narrow strait from the opposite pillar or point of Europe. A small portion of Mauritania was still wanting to the African conquest. But Musa, in the pride of victory, was repulsed from the walls of Ceuta by the vigilance and courage of Count Julian, the general of the Goths. From his disappointment and perplexity, Musa was relieved by an unexpected message of the Christian chief, who offered his place, his person, and his sword to the successors of Mahomet, and solicited the disgraceful honor of introducing their arms into the heart of Spain. If we inquire into the cause of his treachery, the Spaniards will repeat the particular story of his daughter Cava, of a virgin who was seduced or ravished by her sovereign, of a father who sacrificed his religion and country to the thirst of revenge. The passions of princes have often been licentious and destructive, but this well-known tale, romantic in itself, is indifferently supported by external evidence, and the history of Spain will suggest some motive of interest and policy more congenial to the breast of a veteran statesman. After the decease or deposition of Witiza, his 2 sons were supplanted by the ambition of Roderick, a noble Goth, whose father, the duke or governor of a province, had fallen a victim to the preceding tyranny. The monarchy was still elective, but the sons of Witiza, educated on the steps of the throne, were impatient of a private station. Their resentment was the more dangerous, as it was varnished with the dissimulation of courts. Their followers were excited by the remembrance of favors and the promise of a revolution, and their uncle Oppas, Archbishop of Toledo and Seville, was the first person in the church, and the second in the state. It is probable that Julian was involved in the disgrace of the unsuccessful faction, that he had little to hope and much to fear from the new reign, and that the imprudent king could not forget or forgive the injuries which Roderick and his family had sustained. The merit and influence of the count rendered him a useful or formidable subject. His estates were ample, his followers bold and numerous, and it was too fatally shown, that by his Andalusian and Mauritanian commands, he held in his hand the keys of the Spanish monarchy. Too feeble, however, to meet his sovereign in arms, he sought the aid of a foreign power, and his rash invitation of the Moors and Arabs produced the calamities of 800 years. In his epistles, or in a personal interview, he revealed the wealth and nakedness of his country, the weakness of an unpopular prince, the degeneracy of an effeminate people. The Goths were no longer the victorious barbarians who had humbled the pride of Rome, despoiled the queen of nations, and penetrated from the Danube to the Atlantic Ocean. Secluded from the world by the Pyrenean mountains, the successors of Alaric had slumbered in a long peace. The walls of the cities were mouldered into dust, the youth had abandoned the exercise of arms, and the presumption of their ancient renown would expose them in a field of battle to the first assault of the invaders. The ambitious Saracen was fired by the ease and importance of the attempt, but the execution was delayed till he had consulted the commander of the faithful, and his messenger returned with the permission of Walid to annex the unknown kingdoms of the West to the religion and throne of the caliphs. In his residence of Tangier, Musa, with secrecy and caution, continued his correspondence, and hastened his preparations. But the remorse of the conspirators was soothed by the fallacious assurance that he should content himself with the glory and spoil, without aspiring to establish the Moslems beyond the sea that separates Africa from Europe. Before Musa would trust an army of the faithful to the traitors and infidels of a foreign land, he made a less dangerous trial of their strength and veracity. 100 Arabs and 400 Africans passed over in 4 vessels from Tangier to Ceuta. The place of their descent on the opposite shore of the strait is marked by the name of Tarif, their chief, and the date of this memorable event is fixed to the month of Ramadan, of the 91st year of the Hejira, to the month of July, 748 years from the Spanish era of Caesar, 710 after the birth of Christ. From their first station they marched 18 miles through a hilly country to the castle and town of Julian, on which it is still called Algezire. They bestowed the name of the Green Island, from a verdant cape that advances into the sea. Their hospitable entertainment, the Christians who joined their standard, their inroad into a fertile and unguarded province, the richness of their spoil, and the safety of their return, announced to their brethren and the most favorable omens of victory. In the ensuing spring, 5,000 veterans and volunteers were embarked under the command of Tarik, a dauntless and skilful soldier, who surpassed the expectation of his chief, and the necessary transports were provided by the industry of their too faithful ally. The Saracens landed at the pillar or point of Europe. The corrupt and familiar appellation of Gibraltar, Jebel al-Tariq, describes the mountain of Tarik, and the entrenchments of his camp were the first outline of those fortifications which, in the hands of our countrymen, have resisted the art and power of the House of Bourbon. The adjacent governors informed the court of Toledo of the descent and progress of the Arabs, and the defeat of his lieutenant Edeco, who had been commanded to seize and bind the presumptuous strangers, admonished Roderick of the magnitude of the danger. At the royal summons, the dukes and counts, the bishops and nobles of the Gothic monarchy, assembled at the head of their followers; and the title of King of the Romans, which is employed by an Arabic historian, may be excused by the close affinity of language, religion, and manners between the nations of Spain. His army consisted of 90 or 100,000 men, a formidable power if their fidelity and discipline had been adequate to their numbers. The troops of Tarik had been augmented to 12,000 Saracens. But the Christian malcontents were attracted by the influence of Julian, and a crowd of Africans most greedily tasted the temporal blessings of the Koran. In the neighborhood of Cadiz, the town of Xeres has been illustrated by the encounter which determined the fate of the kingdom. The stream of the Guadalete, which falls into the bay, divided the two camps, and marked the advancing and retreating skirmishes of 3 successive and bloody days. On the 4th day, the two armies joined a more serious and decisive issue; but Alaric would have blushed at the sight of his unworthy successor, sustaining on his head a diadem of pearls, encumbered with a flowing robe of gold and silken embroidery, and reclining on a litter or car of ivory drawn by 2 white mules. Notwithstanding the valor of the Saracens, they fainted under the weight of multitudes, and the plain of Xeres was overspread with 16,000 of their dead bodies. "My brethren," said Tarik to his surviving companions, "the enemy is before you, the sea is behind. Whither would ye fly? Follow your general. I am resolved either to lose my life or to trample on the prostrate king of the Romans." Besides the resource of despair, he confided in the secret correspondence and nocturnal interviews of Count Julian with the sons and the brother of Witiza. The 2 princes and the Archbishop of Toledo occupied the most important post. Their well-timed defection broke the ranks of the Christians. Each warrior was prompted by fear or suspicion to consult his personal safety, and the remains of the Gothic army were scattered or destroyed in the flight and pursuit of the 3 following days. Amidst the general disorder, Roderic started from his car, and mounted Aurelia, the fleetest of the horses. But he escaped from a soldier's death to perish more ignobly in the waters of the Bitis or Guadalquivir. His diadem, his robes, and his courser were found on the bank, but as the body of the Gothic prince was lost in the waves, the pride and the ignorance of the Caliph must have been gratified with some meaner head, which was exposed in triumph before the palace of Damascus. And such, continues a valiant historian of the Arabs, is the fate of those kings who withdraw themselves from a field of battle. Count Julian had plunged so deep into guilt and infamy that his only hope was in the ruin of his country. After the battle of Xeres, he recommended the most effectual measures to the victorious Saracen. The king of the Goths is slain, their princes have fled before you, the army is routed, the nation is astonished. Secure with sufficient detachments the cities of Baetica, but in person and without delay march to the royal city of Toledo, and allow not the distracted Christians either time or tranquillity for the election of a new monarch. Tarik listened to his advice. A Roman captive and proselyte who had been enfranchised by the Caliph himself assaulted Cordova with 700 horse. He swam the river, surprised the town, and drove the Christians into the great church, where they defended themselves above 3 months. Another detachment reduced the sea coast of Baetica, which in the last period of the Moorish power had comprised in a narrow space the populous kingdom of Grenada. The march of Tarik from the Betis to the Tagus was directed through the Sierra Morena that separates Andalusia and Castile, till he appeared in arms under the walls of Toledo. The most zealous of the Catholics had escaped with the relics of their saints, and if the gates were shut, it was only till the victor had subscribed a fair and reasonable capitulation. The voluntary exiles were allowed to depart with their effects. 7 churches were appropriated to the Christian worship. The archbishop and his clergy were at liberty to exercise their functions, the monks to practice or neglect their penance, and the Goths and Romans were left in all civil and criminal cases to the subordinate jurisdiction of their own laws and magistrates. But if the justice of Tarik protected the Christians, his gratitude and policy rewarded the Jews, to whose secrets or open aid he was indebted for his most important acquisitions. Persecuted by the kings and synods of Spain, who had often pressed the alternative of banishment or baptism, that outcast nation embraced the moment of revenge. The comparison of their past and present state was the pledge of their fidelity, and the alliance between the disciples of Moses and of Mohammed was maintained until the final era of their common expulsion. From the royal seat of Toledo, the Arabian leader spread his conquests to the north, over the modern realms of Castile and Leon. But it is needless to enumerate the cities that yielded on his approach, or again to describe the table of emerald transported from the east by the Romans, acquired by the Goths among the spoils of Rome, and presented by the Arabs to the throne of Damascus. Beyond the Asturian mountains, the maritime town of Gijon was the term of the lieutenant of Musa, who had performed, with the speed of a traveller, his victorious march of 700 miles from the rock of Gibraltar to the Bay of Biscay. The failure of land compelled him to retreat, and he was recalled to Toledo to excuse the presumption of subduing a kingdom in the absence of his general. Spain, which, in a more savage and disorderly state, had resisted 200 years the arms of the Romans, was overrun in a few months by those of the Saracens, and such was the eagerness of submission and treaty, that the governor of Cordova is recorded as the only chief who fell, without conditions, a prisoner into their hands. The cause of the Goths had been irrevocably judged in the field of Xeres, and in the national dismay, each part of the monarchy declined a contest with the antagonist who had vanquished the united strength of the whole. That strength had been wasted by 2 successive seasons of famine and pestilence; and the governors, who were impatient to surrender, might exaggerate the difficulty of collecting the provisions of a siege. To disarm the Christians, superstition likewise contributed her terrors; and the subtle Arab encouraged the report of dreams, omens, and prophecies, and the portraits of the destined conquerors of Spain, that were discovered on breaking open an apartment of the royal palace. Yet a spark of the vital flame was still alive. Some invincible fugitives preferred a life of poverty and freedom in the Asturian valleys. The hardy mountaineers repulsed the slaves of the Caliph, and the sword of Pelagius has been transformed into the sceptre of the Catholic kings. End of chapter 51, part 8.
Part 9 of the History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 5, by Edward Gibbon. Chapter 51. Conquests by the Arabs, Part 9. On the intelligence of this rapid success, the applause of Musa degenerated into envy, and he began, not to complain, but to fear, that Tarik would leave him nothing to subdue. At the head of 10,000 Arabs and 8,000 Africans, he passed over in person from Mauritania to Spain. The first of his companions were the noblest of the Koreish. His eldest son was left in the command of Africa. The 3 younger brethren were of an age and spirit to second the bold enterprises of their father. At his landing in Algezire, he was respectfully entertained by Count Julian, who stifled his inward remorse, and testified, both in words and actions, that the victory of the Arabs had not impaired his attachment to their cause. Some enemies yet remained for the sword of Musa. The tardy repentance of the Goths had compared their own numbers and those of the invaders. The cities from which the march of Tarik had declined considered themselves as impregnable, and the bravest patriots defended the fortifications of Seville and Merida. They were successfully besieged and reduced by the labor of Musa, who transported his camp from the Boetis to the Anas, from the Guadalquivir to the Guadiana. When he beheld the works of Roman magnificence, the bridge, the aqueducts, the triumphal arches, and the theatre of the ancient metropolis of Lusitania, "I should imagine," said he to his 4 companions, "that the human race must have united their art and power in the foundation of this city. Happy is the man who shall become its master." He aspired to that happiness, but the Emeritans sustained on this occasion the honour of their descent from the veteran legionaries of Augustus. Disdaining the confinement of their walls, they gave battle to the Arabs on the plain; but an ambuscade rising from the shelter of a quarry or a ruin, chastised their indiscretion, and intercepted their return. The wooden turrets of assault were rolled forwards to the foot of the rampart, but the defence of Merida was obstinate and long, and the castle of the martyrs was a perpetual testimony of the losses of the Moslems. The constancy of the besieged was at length subdued by famine and despair, and the prudent victor disguised his impatience under the names of clemency and esteem. The alternative of exile or tribute was allowed; the churches were divided between the 2 religions, and the wealth of those who had fallen in the siege, or retired to Galicia, were confiscated as the reward of the faithful. In the midway between Merida and Toledo, the lieutenant of Musa saluted the vicegerent of the Caliph, and conducted him to the palace of the Gothic kings. Their first interview was cold and formal; a rigid account was exacted of the treasures of Spain; the character of Tarik was exposed to suspicion and obloquy, and the hero was imprisoned, reviled, and ignominiously scourged by the hand, or the command, of Musa. Yet so strict was the discipline, so pure the zeal, or so tame the spirit, of the primitive Moslems, that after this public indignity, Tarik could serve and be trusted in the reduction of the Tarragonest province. A mosque was erected at Saragossa, by the liberality of the Koreish. The port of Barcelona was opened to the vessels of Syria, and the Goths were pursued beyond the Pyrenean mountains into their Gallic province of Septimania or Languedoc. In the church of St. Mary at Carcassonne, Musa found, but it is improbable that he left, 7 equestrian statues of massy silver, and from his term or column of Narbonne he returned on his footsteps to the Galician and Lusitanian shores of the ocean. During the absence of the father, his son Abdelaziz chastised the insurgents of Seville, and reduced, from Malaga to Valencia, the sea coast of the Mediterranean. His original treaty with the discreet and valiant Theodemir will represent the manners and policy of the times. The conditions of peace agreed and sworn between Abdelaziz, the son of Musa, the son of Nasser, and Theodemir, the prince of the Goths. In the name of the most merciful God, Abdelaziz makes peace on these conditions: that Theodemir shall not be disturbed in his principality, nor any injury be offered to the life or property, the wives and children, the religion and temples, of the Christians; that Theodemir shall freely deliver his 7 cities, Orihuela, Valentola, Alicante Mola, Vacasora, Beguera, now Beher, Ora, or Opta, and Lorca; that he shall not assist or entertain the enemies of the Caliph, but shall faithfully communicate his knowledge of their hostile designs; that himself and each of the Gothic nobles shall annually pay 1 piece of gold, 4 measures of wheat, as many of barley, with a certain proportion of honey, oil, and vinegar, and that each of their vassals shall be taxed at 1 moiety of the said imposition. Given the 4th of Regeb, in the year of the Hegira 94, and subscribed with the names of 4 Mussulman witnesses. Theodemir and his subjects were treated with uncommon lenity, but the rate of tribute appears to have fluctuated from a tenth to a fifth, according to the submission or obstinacy of the Christians. In this revolution, many partial calamities were inflicted by the carnal or religious passions of the enthusiasts: some churches were profaned by the new worship, some relics or images were confounded with idols, the rebels were put to the sword, and one town, an obscure place between Cordova and Seville, was razed to its foundations. Yet if we compare the invasion of Spain by the Goths, or its recovery by the kings of Castile and Aragon, we must applaud the moderation and discipline of the Arabian conquerors. The exploits of Musa were performed in the evening of life, though he affected to disguise his age by colouring with a red powder the whiteness of his beard. But in the love of action and glory, his breast was still fired with the ardour of youth, and the possession of Spain was considered only as the first step to the monarchy of Europe. With a powerful armament by sea and land, he was preparing to repass the Pyrenees, to extinguish in Gaul and in Italy the declining kingdoms of the Franks and Lombards, and to preach the unity of God on the altar of the Vatican. From thence, subduing the barbarians of Germany, he proposed to follow the course of the Danube from its source to the Euxine Sea, to overthrow the Greek or Roman Empire of Constantinople, and, returning from Europe to Asia, to unite his new acquisitions with Antioch and the provinces of Syria. But his vast enterprise, perhaps of easy execution, must have seemed extravagant to vulgar minds, and the visionary conqueror was soon reminded of his dependence and servitude. The friends of Tarik had effectually stated his services and wrongs; at the court of Damascus, the proceedings of Musa were blamed, his intentions were suspected, and his delay in complying with the first invitation was chastised by a harsher and more peremptory summons. An intrepid messenger of the Caliph entered his camp at Lugo in Galicia, and, in the presence of the Saracens and Christians, arrested the bridle of his horse. His own loyalty, or that of his troops, inculcated the duty of obedience, and his disgrace was alleviated by the recall of his rival, and the permission of investing with his 2 governments his 2 sons, Abdallah and Abdelaziz. His long triumph from Ceuta to Damascus displayed the spoils of Africa and the treasures of Spain. 400 Gothic nobles, with gold coronets and girdles, were distinguished in his train, and the number of male and female captives, selected for their birth or beauty, was computed at 18 or even 30,000 persons. As soon as he reached Tiberias in Palestine, he was apprised of the sickness and danger of the Caliph, by a private message from Soliman, his brother and presumptive heir, who wished to reserve for his own reign the spectacle of victory. Had Walid recovered, the delay of Musa would have been criminal. He pursued his march, and found an enemy on the throne. In his trial before a partial judge against a popular antagonist, he was convicted of vanity and falsehood, and a fine of 200,000 pieces of gold either exhausted his poverty or proved his rapaciousness. The unworthy treatment of Tarik was revenged by a similar indignity; and the veteran commander, after a public whipping, stood a whole day in the sun before the palace gate, till he obtained a decent exile, under the pious name of a pilgrimage to Mecca. The resentment of the caliph might have been satiated with the ruin of Musa, but his fears demanded the extirpation of a potent and injured family. A sentence of death was intimated with secrecy and speed to the trusty servants of the throne both in Africa and in Spain, and the forms, if not the substance, of justice were superseded in this bloody execution. In the mosque, or palace of Cordova, Abdelaziz was slain by the sword of the conspirators. They accused their governor of claiming the honors of royalty, and his scandalous marriage with Igelona, the widow of Roderick, offended the prejudices both of the Christians and Moslems. By a refinement of cruelty, the head of the son was presented to the father, with an insulting question whether he acknowledged the features of the rebel. "I know his features," he exclaimed with indignation; "I assert his innocence, and I imprecate the same, a juster fate, against the authors of his death." The age and despair of Musa raised him above the power of kings, and he expired at Mecca of the anguish of a broken heart. His rival was more favourably treated, his services were forgiven, and Tarik was permitted to mingle with the crowd of slaves. I am ignorant whether Count Julian was rewarded with the death which he deserved indeed, though not from the hands of the Saracens; but the tale of their ingratitude to the sons of Witiza is disproved by the most unquestionable evidence. The two royal youths were reinstated in the private patrimony of their father; but on the decease of Ebba, the elder, his daughter was unjustly despoiled of her portion by the violence of her uncle Sigebut. The Gothic maid pleaded her cause before the Caliph Hashim, and obtained the restitution of her inheritance; but she was given in marriage to a noble Arabian, and their two sons, Isaac and Ibrahim, were received in Spain with the consideration that was due to their origin and riches. A province is assimilated to the victorious state by the introduction of strangers and the imitative spirit of the natives; and Spain, which had been successively tinctured with Punic and Roman and Gothic blood, imbibed in a few generations the name and manners of the Arabs. The first conquerors, and the 20 successive lieutenants of the caliphs, were attended by a numerous train of civil and military followers, who preferred a distant fortune to a narrow home. The private and public interest was promoted by the establishment of faithful colonies, and the cities of Spain were proud to commemorate the tribe or country of their eastern progenitors. The victorious though motley bands of Tarik and Musa asserted, by the name of Spaniards, their original claim of conquest; yet they allowed their brethren of Egypt to share their establishments of Murcia and Lisbon. The royal legion of Damascus was planted at Cordova; that of Emesa at Seville; that of Kinisrin or Chalcis at Jain; that of Palestine at Algezira and Medina Sidonia. The natives of Yemen and Persia were scattered around Toledo and the inland country; and the fertile seats of Granada were bestowed on 10,000 horsemen of Syria and Iraq, the children of the purest and most noble of the Arabian tribes. A spirit of emulation, sometimes beneficial, more frequently dangerous, was nourished by these hereditary factions. 10 years after the conquest, a map of the province was presented to the caliph; the seas, the rivers, and the harbours, the inhabitants and cities, the climate, the soil, and the mineral productions of the earth. In the space of 2 centuries, the gifts of nature were improved by the agriculture, the manufactures, and the commerce of an industrious people, and the effects of their diligence have been magnified by the idleness of their fancy. The first of the Ommiades who reigned in Spain solicited the support of the Christians, and in his edict of peace and protection he contents himself with a modest imposition of 10,000 ounces of gold, 10,000 pounds of silver, 10,000 horses, as many mules, 1,000 cuirasses, with an equal number of helmets and lances. The most powerful of his successors derived from the same kingdom the annual tribute of 12 millions and 45,000 dinars or pieces of gold, about 6 millions of sterling money, a sum which, in the 10th century, most probably surpassed the united revenues of the Christian monarchs. His royal seat of Cordova contained 600 mosques, 900 baths, and 200,000 houses; he gave laws to 80 cities of the first, to 300 of the second and third order, and the fertile banks of the Guadalquivir were adorned with 12,000 villages and hamlets. The Arabs might exaggerate the truth, but they created and described the most prosperous era of the riches, the cultivation, and the populousness of Spain. The wars of the Moslems were sanctified by the Prophet; but among the various precepts and examples of his life, The Caliphs selected the lessons of toleration that might tend to disarm the resistance of the unbelievers. Arabia was the temple and patrimony of the God of Mohammed, but he beheld with less jealousy and affection the nations of the earth. The polytheists and idolaters, who were ignorant of his name, might be lawfully extirpated by his votaries; but a wise policy supplied the obligation of justice, and after some acts of intolerant zeal, the Mahometan conquerors of Hindostan have spared the pagans of that devout and populous country. The disciples of Abraham, of Moses, and of Jesus, were solemnly invited to accept the more perfect revelations of Mahomet; but if they preferred the payment of a moderate tribute, they were entitled to the freedom of conscience and religious worship. In a field of battle the forfeit lives of the prisoners were redeemed by the profession of Islam; the females were bound to embrace the religion of their masters; and a race of sincere proselytes was gradually multiplied by the education of the infant captives. But the millions of African and Asiatic converts, who swelled the native band of the faithful Arabs, must have been allured, rather than constrained, to declare their belief in one God and the Apostle of God. By the repetition of a sentence and the loss of a foreskin, the subject or the slave, the captive or the criminal, arose in a moment the free and equal companion of the victorious Moslems. Every sin was expiated, every engagement was dissolved, the vow of celibacy was superseded by the indulgence of nature, the active spirits who slept in the cloister were awakened by the trumpet of the Saracens, and in the convulsion of the world, every member of a new society ascended to the natural level of his capacity and courage. The minds of the multitude were tempted by the invisible as well as temporal blessings of the Arabian prophet, and charity will hope that many of his proselytes entertained a serious conviction of the truth and sanctity of his revelation. In the eyes of an inquisitive polytheist, it must appear worthy of the human and the divine nature. More pure than the system of Zoroaster, more liberal than the law of Moses, the religion of Mohammed might seem less inconsistent with reason than the creed of mystery and superstition, which, in the 7th century, disgraced the simplicity of the gospel. In the extensive provinces of Persia and Africa, the national religion has been eradicated by the Mohammedan faith. The ambiguous theology of the Magi stood alone among the sects of the East, but the profane writings of Zoroaster might, under the reverend name of Abraham, be dexterously connected with the chain of divine revelation. Their evil principle, the demon Ahriman, might be represented as the rival, or as the creature of the God of Light. The temples of Persia were devoid of images, but the worship of the sun and of fire might be stigmatized as a gross and criminal idolatry. The milder sentiment was consecrated by the practice of Mahomet and the prudence of the Caliphs. The Magians, or Ghebers, were ranked with the Jews and Christians among the people of the written law, and as late as the 3rd century of the Hegira, the city of Herat will afford a lively contrast of private zeal and public toleration. Under the payment of an annual tribute, the Mohammedan law secured to the Ghebers of Herat their civil and religious liberties, but the recent and humble mosque was overshadowed by the antique splendour of the adjoining Temple of Fire. A fanatic Imam deplored, in his sermons, the scandalous neighbourhood, and accused the weakness or indifference of the faithful. Excited by his voice, the people assembled in tumult; the 2 houses of prayer were consumed by flames, but the vacant ground was immediately occupied by the foundations of a new mosque. The injured Magi appealed to the sovereign of Khorasan; he promised justice and relief, when, behold, 4,000 citizens of Herat, of a grave character and mature age, unanimously swore that the idolatrous fane had never existed; the Inquisition was silenced, and their conscience was satisfied, says the historian Mirchand, with this holy and meritorious perjury. But the greatest part of the temples of Persia were ruined by the insensible and general desertion of their votaries. It was insensible, since it is not accompanied with any memorial of time or place, of persecution or resistance. It was general, since the whole realm, from Shiraz to Samarcand, imbibed the faith of the Koran, and the preservation of the native tongue reveals the descent of the Mahometans of Persia. In the mountains and deserts, an obstinate race of unbelievers adhered to the superstitions of their fathers, and a faint tradition of the Magian theology is kept alive in the province of Kirman, along the banks of the Indus, among the exiles of Surat, and in the colony which, in the last century, was planted by Shah Abbas at the gates of Ispahan. The chief pontiff has retired to Mount Elborz, 18 leagues from the city of Yezd. The perpetual fire, if it continues to burn, is inaccessible to the profane, but his residence is the school, the oracle, and the pilgrimage of the Ghebers, whose hard and uniform features attest the unmingled purity of their blood. Under the jurisdiction of their elders, 80,000 families maintain an innocent and industrious life; their subsistence is derived from some curious manufactures and mechanical trades, and they cultivate the earth with the fervor of a religious duty. Their ignorance withstood the despotism of Shah Abbas, who demanded with threats and tortures the prophetic books of Zoroaster, and this obscure remnant of the Magians is spared by the moderation or contempt of their present sovereigns. The northern coast of Africa is the only land in which the light of the Gospel, after a long and perfect establishment, has been totally extinguished. The arts which had been taught by Carthage and Rome were involved in a cloud of ignorance; the doctrine of Cyprian and Augustine was no longer studied. 500 episcopal churches were overturned by the hostile fury of the Donatists, the Vandals, and the Moors. The zeal and numbers of the clergy declined, and the people, without discipline or knowledge or hope, submissively sunk under the yoke of the Arabian prophet. Within 50 years after the expulsion of the Greeks, a lieutenant of Africa informed the Caliph that the tribute of the infidels was abolished by their conversion, and though he sought to disguise his fraud and rebellion, his specious pretence was drawn from the rapid and extensive progress of the Mohammedan faith. In the next age, an extraordinary mission of 5 bishops was detached from Alexandria to Cairo. They were ordained by the Jacobite patriarch to cherish and revive the dying embers of Christianity, but the interposition of a foreign prelate, a stranger to the Latins, an enemy to the Catholics, supposes the decay and dissolution of the African hierarchy. It was no longer the time when the successors of St. Cyprian, at the head of a numerous synod, could maintain an equal contest with the ambition of the Roman pontiff. In the 11th century, the unfortunate priest who was seated on the ruins of Carthage implored the arms and the protection of the Vatican, and he bitterly complains that his naked body had been scourged by the Saracens, and that his authority was disputed by the 4 suffragans, the tottering pillars of his throne. 2 epistles of Gregory VII are destined to soothe the distress of the Catholics and the pride of a Moorish prince. The Pope assures the Sultan that they both worship the same God, and may hope to meet in the bosom of Abraham; but the complaint that 3 bishops could no longer be found to consecrate a brother, announces the speedy and inevitable ruin of the episcopal order. The Christians of Africa and Spain had long since submitted to the practice of circumcision and the legal abstinence from wine and pork, and the name of Mozarabes, adoptive Arabs, was applied to their civil or religious conformity. About the middle of the 12th century, the worship of Christ and the succession of pastors were abolished along the coast of Barbary, and in the kingdoms of Cordova and Seville, of Valencia and Granada. The throne of the Almohades, or Unitarians, was founded on the blindest fanaticism, and their extraordinary rigour might be provoked or justified by the recent victories and intolerant zeal of the princes of Sicily and Castilla, of Aragon and Portugal. The faith of the Mozarabes was occasionally revived by the papal missionaries, and on the landing of Charles V, some families of Latin Christians were encouraged to rear their heads at Tunis and Algiers. But the seed of the Gospel was quickly eradicated, and the long province from Tripoli to the Atlantic has lost all memory of the language and religion of Rome. After the revolution of 11 centuries, the Jews and Christians of the Turkish Empire enjoy the liberty of conscience which was granted by the Arabian caliphs. They suspected the loyalty of the Catholics, whose name of Melkites betrayed their secret attachment to the Greek emperor, while the Nestorians and Jacobites, his inveterate enemies, approved themselves the sincere and voluntary friends of the Mahometan government. Yet this partial jealousy was healed by time and submission; the churches of Egypt were shared with the Catholics, and all the Oriental sects were included in the common benefits of toleration. The rank, the immunities, the domestic jurisdiction of the patriarchs, the bishops, and the clergy, were protected by the civil magistrate; the learning of individuals recommended them to the employment of secretaries and physicians; they were enriched by the lucrative collection of the revenue, and their merit was sometimes raised to the command of cities and provinces. A caliph of the house of Abbas was heard to declare that the Christians were most worthy of trust in the administration of Persia. "The Moslems," said he, "will abuse their present fortunes, the Magians regret their fallen greatness, and the Jews are impatient for their approaching deliverance. But the slaves of despotism are exposed to the alternatives of favour and disgrace. The captive churches of the East have been afflicted in every age by the avarice or bigotry of their rulers, and the ordinary and legal restraints must be offensive to the pride or the zeal of the Christians. About 200 years after Mahomet, they were separated from their fellow subjects by a turban or girdle of less honorable color. Instead of horses or mules, they were condemned to ride on asses, in the attitude of women. Their public and private building were measured by a diminutive standard. In the streets or the baths, it is their duty to give way or bow down before the meanest of people, and their testimony is rejected, if it may tend to the prejudice of a true believer. The pomp of processions, the sound of bells or of psalmody, is interdicted in their worship. A decent reverence for the national faith is imposed on their sermons and conversations, and the sacrilegious attempt to enter a mosque or to seduce a Mussulman will not be suffered to escape with impunity. In a time, however, of tranquillity and peace, the Christians have never been compelled to renounce the Gospel, or to embrace the Koran, but the punishment of death is inflicted upon the apostates who have professed and deserted the law of Mohammed. The martyrs of Cordova provoked the sentence of the Qadri, by the public profession of their inconstancy, or their passionate invectives against the person and religion of the Prophet. At the end of the first century of the Hegira, the Caliphs were the most potent and absolute monarchs of the globe. Their prerogative was not circumscribed, either in right or in fact, by the power of the nobles, the freedom of the commons, the privileges of the Church, the votes of a Senate, or the memory of a free constitution. The authority of the companions of Mahomet expired with their lives, and the chiefs or emirs of the Arabian tribes left behind, in the desert, the spirit of equality and independence. The regal and sacerdotal characters were united in the successors of Mahomet, and if the Koran was the rule of their actions, they were supreme judges and interpreters of that divine book. They reigned by the right of conquest over the nations of the East, to whom the name of liberty was unknown, and who were accustomed to applaud in their tyrants the acts of violence and severity that were exercised at their own expense. Under the last of the Omeyyades, the Arabian Empire extended 200 days' journey from east to west, from the confines of Tartary and India to the shores of the Atlantic Ocean. And if we retrench the sleeve of the robe, as it is styled by their writers, the long and narrow province of Africa, the solid and compact dominion from Fargana to Aden, from Tarsus to Surat, will spread on every side to the measure of 4 or 5 months of the march of a caravan. We should vainly seek the indissoluble union and easy obedience that pervaded the government of Augustus and the Antonines, but the progress of the Mohammedan religion diffused over this ample space a general resemblance of manners and opinions. The language and laws of the Koran were studied with equal devotion at Samarcand and Seville. The Moor and the Indian embraced as countrymen and brothers in the pilgrimage of Mecca, and the Arabian language was adopted as the popular idiom in all the provinces to the westward of the Tigris. End of chapter 51, part 9.
Chapter 52, Part 1 of The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine. The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 5, Chapter 52, Part 1. The two sieges of Constantinople by the Arabs, their invasion of France and defeat by Charles Martel, civil war of the Omeyyades and Abbasides, learning of the Arabs, luxury of the Caliphs, naval enterprises on Crete, Sicily, and Rome, decay and division of the empire of the Caliphs, defeats and victories of the Greek emperors. When the Arabs first issued from the desert, they must have been surprised at the ease and rapidity of their own success. But when they advanced in the career of victory to the banks of the Indus and the summit of the Pyrenees, when they had repeatedly tried the edge of their scimitars and the energy of their faith, they might be equally astonished that any nation could resist their invincible arms, that any boundary should confine the diminution of the successor of the Prophet. The confidence of soldiers and fanatics may indeed be excused, since the calm historian of the present hour who strives to follow the rapid course of the Saracens, must study to explain by what means the Church and State were saved from this impending, and, as it should seem, from this inevitable danger. The deserts of Scythia and Sarmatia might be guarded by their extent, their climate, their poverty, and the courage of the northern shepherds. China was remote and inaccessible, but the greatest part of the temperate zone was subject to the Mahometan conquerors. The Greeks were exhausted by the calamities of war and the loss of their fairest provinces, and the barbarians of Europe might justly tremble at the precipitate fall of the Gothic monarchy. In this inquiry I shall unfold the events that rescued our ancestors of Britain and our neighbors of Gaul from the civil and religious yoke of the Koran, that protected the majesty of Rome and delayed the servitude of Constantinople, that invigorated the defence of the Christians and scattered amongst their enemies the seeds of division and decay. 46 years after the flight of Mahomet from Mecca, his disciples appeared in arms under the walls of Constantinople. They were animated by a genuine or fictitious saying of the prophet, that, to the first army which besieged the city of the Caesars, their sins were forgiven. The long series of Roman triumphs would be meritoriously transferred to the conquerors of New Rome, and the wealth of nations was deposited in this well-chosen seat of royalty and commerce. No sooner had the Caliph Moawiyah suppressed his rivals and established his throne, than he aspired to expiate the guilt of civil blood by the success and glory of his holy expedition. His preparations by sea and land were adequate to the importance of the object. His standard was entrusted to Sophian, a veteran warrior, but the troops were encouraged by example and presence of Yezid, the son and presumptive heir of the commander of the faithful. The Greeks had little to hope, nor had their enemies any reason of fear, from the courage and vigilance of the reigning emperor, who disgraced the name of Constantine, and imitated only the inglorious years of his grandfather Heraclius. Without delay or opposition, the naval forces of the Saracens passed through the unguarded channel of the Hellespont, which even now, under the feeble and disorderly government of the Turks, is maintained as the natural bulwark of the capital. The Arabian fleet cast anchor, and the troops were disembarked near the palace of Hebdomon, 7 miles from the city. During many days, from the dawn of light to the evening, the line of assault was extended from the Golden Gate to the eastern promontory, and the foremost warriors were impelled by the weight and effort of the succeeding columns. But the besiegers had formed an insufficient estimate of the strength and resources of Constantinople. The solid and lofty walls were guarded by numbers and discipline. The spirit of the Romans was rekindled by the last danger of their religion and empire. The fugitives from the conquered provinces more successfully renewed the defence of Damascus and Alexandria, and the Saracens were dismayed by the strange and prodigious effects of artificial fire. This firm and effectual resistance diverted their arms to the more easy attempt of plundering the European and Asiatic coasts of the Propontis, and, after keeping the sea from the month of April to that of September, on the approach of winter they retreated 80 miles from the capital, to the Isle of Cyzicus, in which they had established their magazine of spoil and provisions. So patient was their perseverance, or so languid were their operations, that they repeated in the 6 following summers the same attack and retreat, with a gradual abatement of hope and vigor, till the mischances of shipwreck and disease, of the sword and of fire, compelled them to relinquish the fruitless enterprise. They might bewail the loss, or commemorate the martyrdom, of 30,000 Moslems who fell in the siege of Constantinople, and the solemn funeral of Abu Ayub, or Job, excited the curiosity of the Christians themselves. That venerable Arab, one of the last of the companions of Mahomet, was numbered among the Ansars, or auxiliaries, of Medina, who sheltered the head of the flying prophet. In his youth he fought at Bedr and Ohud under the holy standard, In his mature age, he was the friend and follower of Ali, and the last remnant of his strength and life was consumed in a distant and dangerous war against the enemies of the Koran. His memory was revered, but the place of his burial was neglected and unknown, during a period of 780 years, till the conquest of Constantinople by Mohammed II. A seasonable vision, for such are the manufacture of every religion, revealed the holy spot at the foot of the walls and the bottom of the harbor, and the marsh of Ayoub has been deservedly chosen for the symbol and martial inauguration of the Turkish sultans. The event of the siege revived, both in the east and west, the reputation of the Roman arms, and cast a momentary shade over the glories of the Saracens. The Greek ambassador was favorably received at Damascus. A general council of the emirs or Koreish, a peace or truce of 30 years was ratified between the two empires, and the stipulation of an annual tribute, 50 horses of a noble breed, 50 slaves, and 3,000 pieces of gold, degraded the majesty of the commander of the faithful. The aged caliph was desirous of possessing his dominions, and ending his days in tranquillity and repose. While the Moors and Indians trembled at his name, his palace and city of Damascus was insulted by the Mardites, or Maronites, of Mount Libanus, the firmest barrier of the empire, till they were disarmed and transplanted by the suspicious policy of the Greeks. After the revolt of Arabia and Persia, the house of Ommiyah was reduced to the kingdoms of Syria and Egypt. Their distress and fear enforced their compliance with the pressing demands of the Christians, and the tribute was increased to a slave, a horse, and 1,000 pieces of gold, for each of the 365 days of the solar year. But as soon as the empire was again united by the arms and policy of Abd al Malek, he disclaimed a badge of servitude not less injurious to his conscience than to his pride. He discontinued the payment of the tribute, and the resentment of the Greeks was disabled from action by the mad tyranny of the second Justinian, the just rebellion of his subjects, and the frequent change of his antagonists and successors. Till the reign of Abdalmalek, the Saracens had been content with the free possession of the Persian and Roman treasures, in the coins of Chosroes and Caesar. By the command of that caliph, a national mint was established, both for silver and gold, and the inscription of the dinar, though it might be censured by some timorous casuists, proclaimed the unity of the God of Mahomet. Under the reign of the Caliph Walid, the Greek language and characters were excluded from the accounts of the public revenue. If this change was productive of the invention or familiar use of our present numerals, the Arabic or Indian ciphers, as they are commonly styled, a regulation of office has promoted the most important discoveries of arithmetic, algebra, and the mathematical sciences. Whilst the Caliph Walid sat idle on the throne of Damascus, whilst his lieutenants achieved the conquest of Transoxiana and Spain, a third army of Saracens overspread the provinces of Asia Minor, and approached the borders of the Byzantine capital. But the attempt and disgrace of the second siege was reserved for his brother Soliman, whose ambition appears to have been quickened by a more active and martial spirit. In the revolutions of the Greek empire, after the tyrant Justinian had been punished and avenged, an humble secretary, Anastasius or Artemius, was promoted by chance or merit to the vacant purple. He was alarmed by the sound of war, and his ambassador returned from Damascus with the tremendous news that the Saracens were preparing an armament by sea and land, such as would transcend the experience of the past or the belief of the present age. The precautions of Anastasius were not unworthy of his station or of the impending danger. He issued a peremptory mandate that all persons who were not provided with the means of subsistence for a 3 years' siege should evacuate the city. The public granaries and arsenals were abundantly replenished. The walls were restored and strengthened, and the engines for casting stones, or darts, or fire, were stationed along the ramparts, or in the brigantines of war, of which an additional number was hastily constructed. To prevent is safer, as well as more honorable, than to repel an attack, and a design was meditated, above the usual spirit of Greeks, of burning the naval stores of the enemy, the cypress timber that had been hewn in Mount Libanus, and was piled along the seashore of Phoenicia, for the service of the Egyptian fleet. This generous enterprise was defeated by the cowardice or treachery of the troops, who, in the new language of the empire, were styled of the obsequian theme. They murdered their chief, deserted their standard in the Isle of Rhodes, dispersed themselves over the adjacent continent, and reserved pardon or reward by investing with the purple a simple officer of the revenue. The name of Theodosius might recommend him to the senate and people, but, after some months, he sunk into cloister, and resigned to the firmer hand of Leo the Isaurian the urgent defence of the capital and empire. The most formidable of the Saracens, Moslemah, the brother of the caliph, was advancing at the head of 120,000 Arabs and Persians, the greater part mounted on horses or camels; and the successful sieges of Tyana, Amorium, and Pergamus were of sufficient duration to exercise their skill and elevate their hopes. At the well-known passage of Abydus, on the Hellespont, the Mahometan arms were transported, for the first time, from Asia to Europe. From thence, wheeling round the Thracian cities of the Propontis, Moslemah invested Constantinople on the land side, surrounded his camp with a ditch and rampart, prepared and planted his engines of assault, and declared, by words and actions, a patient resolution of expecting the return of seed time and harvest, should the obstinacy of the besieged prove equal to his own. The Greeks would gladly have ransomed their religion and empire by a fine or a settlement of a piece of gold on the head of each inhabitant of the city; but the liberal offer was rejected and disdained, and the presumption of Moslemah was exalted by the speedy approach and invincible force of the natives of Egypt and Syria. They are said to have amounted to 1,800 ships; the number betrays their inconsiderable size, and of the 20 stout and capacious vessels, whose magnitude impeded their progress, each was manned with no more than 100 heavy armed soldiers. This huge armada proceeded on a smooth sea, and with a gentle gale, towards the mouth of the Bosphorus. The surface of the strait was overshadowed, in the language of the Greeks, with a moving forest, and the same fatal night had been fixed by the Saracen chief for a general assault by sea and land. To allure the confidence of the enemy, the emperor had thrown aside the chain that usually guarded the entrance of the harbor; but while they hesitated whether they should seize the opportunity or apprehend the snare, the ministers of destruction were at hand. The fireships of the Greeks were launched against them. The Arabs, their arms and vessels, were involved in the same flames. The disorderly fugitives were dashed against each other or overwhelmed in the waves; and I no longer find a vestige of the fleet that had threatened to extirpate the Roman name. A still more fatal and irreparable loss was that of the Caliph Soliman, who died of an indigestion in his camp near Kinisrin, or Chalcis, in Syria, as he was preparing to lead against Constantinople the remaining forces of the East. The brother of Moslemah was succeeded by a kinsman and an enemy, and the throne of an active and able prince was degraded by the useless and pernicious virtues of a bigot. While he started and satisfied the scruples of a blind conscience, the siege was continued through the winter by the neglect, rather than by the resolution of the Caliph Omar. The winter proved uncommonly rigorous. Above 100 days the ground was covered with deep snow, and the natives of the sultry climes of Egypt and Arabia lay torpid and almost lifeless in the frozen camp. They revived on the return of spring; a second effort had been made in their favor, and their distress was relieved by the arrival of two numerous fleets laden with corn and arms and soldiers: the first from Alexandria, of 400 transports and galleys; the second of 360 vessels from the ports of Africa. But the Greek fires were again kindled, and if the destruction was less complete, it was owing to the experience which had taught the Moslems to remain at a safe distance, or to the perfidy of the Egyptian mariners, who deserted with their ships to the emperor of the Christians. The trade and navigation of the capital were restored, and the produce of the fisheries supplied the wants and even the luxury of the inhabitants. But the calamities of famine and disease were soon felt by the troops of Moslemah, and as the former was miserably assuaged, so the latter was dreadfully propagated, by the pernicious nutriment which hunger compelled them to extract from the most unclean or unnatural food. The spirit of conquest and even of enthusiasm was extinct. The Saracens could no longer struggle beyond their lines either single or in small parties, without exposing themselves to the merciless retaliation of the Thracian peasants. An army of Bulgarians was attracted from the Danube by the gifts and promises of Leo, and these savage auxiliaries made some atonement for the evils which they had inflicted on the empire by the defeat and slaughter of 22,000 Asiatics. A report was dexterously scattered that the Franks, the unknown nations of the Latin world, were arming by sea and land in the defence of the Christian cause, and their formidable aid was expected with far different sensations in the camp and city. At length, after a siege of 13 months, the hopeless Moslemah received from the Caliph the welcome permission of retreat. The march of the Arabian cavalry over the Hellespont and through the provinces of Asia was executed without delay or molestation; but an army of their brethren had been cut in pieces on the side of Bithynia, and the remains of the fleet were so repeatedly damaged by tempest and fire that only 5 galleys entered the port of Alexandria to relate the tale of their various and almost incredible disasters. In the 2 sieges the deliverance of Constantinople may be chiefly ascribed to the novelty, the terrors and the real efficacy of the Greek fire. The important secret of compounding and directing this artificial flame was imparted by Callinicus, a native of Heliopolis in Syria, who deserted from the service of the Caliph to that of the emperor. The skill of a chemist and engineer was equivalent to the succor of fleets and armies, and this discovery or improvement of the military art was fortunately reserved for the distressful period when the degenerate Romans of the East were incapable of contending with the warlike enthusiasm and youthful vigor of the Saracens. The historian who presumes to analyze this extraordinary composition should suspect his own ignorance and that of his Byzantine guides, so prone to the marvelous, so careless, and, in this instance, so jealous of the truth. From their obscure and perhaps fallacious hints, it should seem that the principal ingredient of the Greek fire was the naphtha, or liquid bitumen, a light, tenacious, and inflammable oil which springs from the earth, and catches fire as soon as it comes in contact with the air. The naphtha was mingled, I know not by what methods or in what proportions, with sulphur and with the pitch that is extracted from evergreen firs. From this mixture, which produced a thick smoke and a loud explosion, proceeded a fierce and obstinate flame, which not only rose in perpendicular ascent, but likewise burned with equal vehemence in descent or lateral progress. Instead of being extinguished, it was nourished and quickened by the element of water; and sand, urine, or vinegar were the only remedies that could damp the fury of this powerful agent, which was justly denominated by the Greeks the liquid, or the maritime, fire. For the annoyance of the enemy it was employed with equal effect by sea and land, in battles or in sieges. It was either poured from the rampart in large boilers, or launched in red-hot balls of stone and iron, or darted in arrows and javelins twisted round with flax and tow, which had deeply imbibed the inflammable oil. Sometimes it was deposited in fire-ships, the victims and instruments of a mere ample revenge, and was most commonly blown through long tubes of copper, which were planted on the prow of a galley, and fancifully shaped into the mouths of savage monsters that seemed to vomit a stream of liquid and consuming fire. This important art was preserved at Constantinople as the palladium of the state. The galleys and artillery might occasionally be lent to the allies of Rome, but the composition of the Greek fire was concealed with the most jealous scruple, and the terror of the enemies was increased and prolonged by their ignorance and surprise. In the treatise of the administration of the empire, the royal author suggests the answers and excuses that might best elude the indiscreet curiosity and importunate demands of the barbarians. They should be told that the mystery of the Greek fire had been revealed by an angel to the first and greatest of the Constantines, with a sacred injunction that this gift of heaven, this peculiar blessing of the Romans, should never be communicated to any foreign nation; that the prince and the subject were alike bound to religious silence under the temporal and spiritual penalties of treason and sacrilege; and that the impious attempt would provoke the sudden and supernatural vengeance of the God of the Christians. By these precautions the secret was confined, above 400 years, to the Romans of the East, and at the end of the 11th century the peasants, to whom every sea and every art were familiar, suffered the effects without understanding the composition of the Greek fire. It was at length either discovered or stolen by the Mahometans, and, in the holy wars of Syria and Egypt, they reported an invention contrived against themselves on the heads of the Christians. A knight who despised the swords and lances of the Saracens relates, with heartfelt sincerity, his own fears and those of his companions at the sight and sound of the mischievous engine that discharged a torrent of the Greek fire, the Foe Gregois, as it is styled by the more early of the French writers. "It came flying through the air," says Joinville, "like a winged long-tailed dragon, about the thickness of a hogshead, with the report of thunder and the velocity of lightning, and the darkness of the night was dispelled by this deadly illumination. The use of the Greek, or as it might now be called, of the Saracen fire, was continued to the middle of the 14th century, when the scientific or casual compound of nitro, sulphur, and charcoal effected a new revolution in the art of war and the history of mankind." Chapter 52. Part II. Of the History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine. The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 5, Chapter 52, Part II. Constantinople and the Greek fire might exclude the Arabs from the eastern entrance of Europe, but in the west, on the side of the Pyrenees, the provinces of Gaul were threatened and invaded by the conquerors of Spain. The decline of the French monarchy invited the attack of these insatiate fanatics. The descendants of Clovis had lost the inheritance of his martial and ferocious spirit, and their misfortune or demerit has affixed the epithet of lazy to the last kings of the Merovingian race. They ascended the throne without power, and sank into the grave without a name. A country palace, in the neighborhood of Champagne, was allotted for their residence or prison; but each year, in the month of March or May, they were conducted in a wagon drawn by oxen to the assembly of the Franks, to give audience to foreign ambassadors and to ratify the acts of the mayor of the palace. That domestic officer was become the minister of the nation and the master of the prince. A public employment was converted into the patrimony of a private family. The elder Pepin left a king of mature years under the guardianship of his own widow and her child, and these feeble regents were forcibly dispossessed by the most active of his bastards. A government, half savage and half corrupt, was almost dissolved, and the tributary dukes and provincial counts, and the territorial lords, were tempted to despise the weakness of the monarch, and to imitate the ambition of the mayor. Among these independent chiefs, one of the boldest and most successful was Eudes, Duke of Aquitaine. who in the southern provinces of Gaul usurped the authority and even the title of king. The Goths, the Gascons, and the Franks assembled under the standard of this Christian hero. He repelled the first invasion of the Saracens, and Zama, lieutenant of the Caliph, lost his army and his life under the walls of Toulouse. The ambition of his successors was stimulated by revenge. They repassed the Pyrenees with the means and the resolution of conquest. The advantageous situation which had recommended Narbonne as the first Roman colony was again chosen by the Moslems. They claimed the province of Septimania or Languedoc as a just dependence of the Spanish monarchy. The vineyards of Gascony and the city of Bordeaux were possessed by the sovereign of Damascus and Samarcand, and the south of France, from the mouth of the Garonne to that of the Rhone, assumed the manners and religion of Arabia. But these narrow limits were scorned by the spirit of Abd al Rahman, or Abdi Ram, who had been restored by the Caliph Hashem to the wishes of the soldiers and people of Spain. That veteran and daring commander adjudged to the obedience of the Prophet whatever yet remained of France or of Europe, and prepared to execute this sentence, at the head of a formidable host, in the full confidence of surmounting all opposition either of nature or of man. His first care was to suppress a domestic rebel, who commanded the most important passes on the Pyrenees. Manuza, a Moorish chief, had accepted the alliance of the Duke of Aquitaine, and Eudes, from a motive of private or public interest, devoted his beauteous daughter to the embraces of the African misbeliever. But the strongest fortresses of Cerdagne were invested by a superior force. The rebel was overtaken and slain in the mountains, and his widow was sent a captive to Damascus to gratify the desires, or more probably the vanity, of the commander of the faithful. From the Pyrenees, Abdiram proceeded without delay to the passage of the Rhone and the siege of Arles. An army of Christians attempted the relief of the city. The tombs of their leaders were yet visible in the 13th century, and many thousands of their dead bodies were carried down the rapid stream into the Mediterranean Sea. The arms of Abdimar were not less successful on the side of the ocean. He passed without opposition the Garonne and Dordogne, which unite their waters in the Gulf of Bordeaux, but he found, beyond those rivers, the camp of the intrepid Eudes, who had formed a second army and sustained a second defeat, so fatal to the Christians, that, according to their sad confession, God alone could reckon the number of the slain. The victorious Saracen overran the provinces of Aquitaine, whose Gallic names are disguised, rather than lost, in the modern appellations of Perigord, Saintonge, and Poitou. His standards were planted on the walls, or at least before the gates, of Tours and of Sens, and his detachments overspread the kingdom of Burgundy as far as the well-known cities of Lyons and Besançon. The memory of these devastations, for Abdimar did not spare the country or the people, was long preserved by tradition, and the invasion of France by the Moors or Mahometans affords the groundwork of those fables which have been so wildly disfigured in the romances of chivalry, and so elegantly adorned by the Italian muse. In the decline of society and art, the deserted cities could supply a slender booty to the Saracens. Their richest spoil was found in the churches and monasteries, which they stripped of their ornaments and delivered to the flames. And the tutelar saints, both Hilary of Poitiers and Martin of Tours, forgot their miraculous powers in the defense of their own sepulchres. A victorious line of march had been prolonged above 1,000 miles, from the rock of Gibraltar to the banks of the Loire. The repetition of an equal space would have carried the Saracens to the confines of Poland and the highlands of Scotland. The Rhine is not more impassable than the Nile or Euphrates, and the Arabian fleet might have sailed without a naval combat into the mouth of the Thames. Perhaps the interpretation of the Koran would now be taught in the schools of Oxford, and her pulpits might demonstrate to a circumcised people the sanctity and truth of the revelation of Mahomet. From such calamities was Christendom delivered by the genius and fortune of one man. Charles, the illegitimate son of the elder Pepin, was content with the titles of Mayor or Duke of the Franks, but he deserved to become the father of a line of kings. In a laborious administration of 24 years, he restored and supported the dignity of the throne, and the rebels of Germany and Gaul were successively crushed by the activity of a warrior, who, in the same campaign, could display his banner on the Elbe, the Rhone, and the shores of the ocean. In the public danger he was summoned by the voice of his country, and his rival, the Duke of Aquitaine, was reduced to appear among the fugitives and suppliants. "Alas!" exclaimed the Franks, "what a misfortune! What an indignity! We have long heard of the name and conquests of the Arabs; we are apprehensive of their attack from the east. They have now conquered Spain, and invade our country on the side of the west. Yet their numbers and, since they have no buckler, their arms are inferior to our own." "If you follow my advice," replied the prudent mayor of the palace, "you will not interrupt their march, nor precipitate your attack. They are like a torrent which it is dangerous to stem in its career. The thirst of riches and the consciousness of success redouble their valor, and valor is of more avail than arms or numbers. Be patient till they have loaded themselves with the encumbrance of wealth. The possession of wealth will divide their counsels and assure your victory." This subtle policy is perhaps a refinement of the Arabian writers, and the situation of Charles will suggest a more narrow and selfish motive of procrastination, the secret desire of humbling the pride and wasting the provinces of the rebel Duke of Aquitaine. It is yet more probable that the delays of Charles were inevitable and reluctant. A standing army was unknown under the first and second race; more than half the kingdom was now in the hands of the Saracens, according to their respective situation. The Franks of Neustria and Austrasia were too conscious or too careless of the impending danger, and the voluntary aids of the Gepidae and Germans were separated by a long interval from the standard of the Christian general. No sooner had he collected his forces than he sought and found the enemy in the centre of France, between Tours and Poitiers. His well conducted march was covered with a range of hills, and Abdimar appears to have been surprised by his unexpected presence. The nations of Asia, Africa, and Europe advanced with equal ardor to an encounter which would change the history of the world. In the 6 first days of desultory combat, the horsemen and archers of the East maintained their advantage; but in the closer onset of the 7th day, the Orientals were oppressed by the strength and stature of the Germans, who, with stout hearts and iron hands, asserted the civil and religious freedom of their posterity. The epithet of Martel, the Hammer, which has been added to the name of Charles, is expressive of his weighty and irresistible strokes. The valor of Eudes was excited by resentment and emulation, and their companions, in the eye of history, are the true peers and paladins of French chivalry. After a bloody feud in which Abdimram was slain, the Saracens in the close of the evening retired to their camp. In the disorder and despair of the night, the various tribes of Yemen and Damascus, of Africa and Spain, were provoked to turn their arms against each other; the remains of their host was suddenly dissolved, and each emir consulted his safety by a hasty and separate retreat. At the dawn of the day, the stillness of a hostile camp was suspected by the victorious Christians. On the report of their spies, they ventured to explore the riches of the vacant tents. But if we except some celebrated relics, a small portion of the spoil was restored to the innocent and lawful owners. The joyful tidings were soon diffused over the Catholic world, and the monks of Italy could affirm and believe that 350 or 375,000 of the Mahometans had been crushed by the hammer of Charles, while no more than 1,500 Christians were slain in the field of Tours. But this incredible tale is sufficiently disproved by the caution of the French general, who apprehended the snares and accidents of a pursuit, and dismissed his German allies to their native forests. The inactivity of a conqueror betrays the loss of strength and blood, and the most cruel execution is inflicted, not in the ranks of battle, but on the backs of a flying enemy. Yet the victory of the Franks was complete and final. Aquitaine was recovered by the arms of Eudes. The Arabs never resumed the conquest of Gaul, and they were soon driven beyond the Pyrenees by Charles Martel and his valiant race. It might have been expected that the savior of Christendom would have been canonized, or at least applauded by the gratitude of the clergy, who are indebted to his sword for their present existence. But in the public distress, the mayor of the palace had been compelled to apply the riches, or at least the revenues, of the bishops and abbots to the relief of the state and the reward of the soldiers. His merits were forgotten, his sacrilege alone was remembered; and in an epistle to a Carlovingian prince, a Gallic synod presumes to declare that his ancestor was damned; that on the opening of his tomb the spectators were affrighted by a smell of fire and the aspect of a horrid dragon; and that a saint of the times was indulged with a pleasant vision of the soul and body of Charles Martel burning to all eternity in the abyss of hell. The loss of an army or a province in the Western world was less painful to the court of Damascus than the rise and progress of a domestic competitor. Except among the Syrians, the caliphs of the house of Ommiyah had never been the objects of the public favor. The life of Mahomet recorded their perseverance in idolatry and rebellion. Their conversion had been reluctant, their elevation irregular and factious, and their throne was cemented with the most holy and noble blood of Arabia. The best of their race, the pious Omar, was dissatisfied with his own title. Their personal virtues were insufficient to justify a departure from the order of succession, and the eyes and wishes of the faithful were turned towards the line of Hashem, and the kindred of the Apostle of God. Of these the Fatimites were either rash or pusillanimous, but the descendants of Abbas cherished, with courage and discretion, the hopes of their rising fortunes. From an obscure residence in Syria, they secretly dispatched their agents and missionaries, who preached in the eastern provinces their hereditary indefeasible right, and Mohammed, the son of Ali, the son of Abdallah, the son of Abbas, the uncle of the Prophet, gave audience to the deputies of Khorasan, and accepted their free gift of 400,000 pieces of gold. After the death of Mohammed, the oath of allegiance was administered in the name of his son Ibrahim to a numerous band of votaries, who expected only a signal and a leader, and the governor of Khorasan continued to deplore his fruitless admonitions and the deadly slumber of the caliphs of Damascus, till he himself, with all his adherents, was driven from the city and palace of Meru by the rebellious arms of Abu Moslem. That maker of kings, the author, as he is named, of the call of the Abbassides, was at length rewarded for his presumption of merit with the usual gratitude of courts. A mean, perhaps a foreign, extraction could not repress the aspiring energy of Abu Moslem. Jealous of his wives, liberal of his wealth, prodigal of his own blood and of that of others, he could boast with pleasure, and possibly with truth, that he had destroyed 600,000 of his enemies; and such was the intrepid gravity of his mind and countenance, that he was never seen to smile except on a day of battle. In the visible separation of parties, the green was consecrated to the Fatimites, the Ommiades were distinguished by the white, and the black, as the most adverse, was naturally adopted by the Abbassides. Their turbans and garments were stained with that gloomy color. Two black standards, on pike staves 9 cubits long, were borne aloft in the van of Abu Moslem, and their allegorical names of the night and the shadow obscurely represented the indissoluble union and perpetual succession of the line of Hashem. From the Indus to the Euphrates, the East was convulsed by the quarrel of the white and the black factions. The Abbassides were most frequently victorious, but their public success was clouded by the personal misfortune of their chief. The court of Damascus, awakening from a long slumber, resolved to prevent the pilgrimage of Mecca, which Ibrahim had undertaken with a splendid retinue, to recommend himself at once to the favor of the prophet and of the people. A detachment of cavalry intercepted his march and arrested his person, and the unhappy Ibrahim, snatched away from the promise of untasted royalty, expired in iron fetters in the dungeons of Haran. His two younger brothers, Saffah and Almansor, eluded the search of the tyrant, and lay concealed at Cufa, till the zeal of the people and the approach of his Eastern friends allowed them to expose their persons to the impatient public. On Friday, in the dress of a caliph, in the colors of the sect, Saffah proceeded with religious and military pomp to the mosque. Ascending the pulpit, he prayed and preached as the lawful successor of Mahomet, and, after his departure, his kinsmen bound a willing people by an oath of fidelity. But it was on the banks of the Zab, and not in the mosque of Cufa, that this important controversy was determined. Every advantage appeared to be on the side of a white faction. The authority of established government, an army of 120,000 soldiers, against a sixth part of that number, and the presence and merit of the Caliph Mervan, the 14th and last of the house of Ommiyah. Before his accession to the throne, he had deserved, by his Gregorian warfare, the honorable epithet of the ass of Mesopotamia; and he might have been ranked amongst the greatest princes, had not, says Abulfida, the eternal order decreed that moment for the ruin of his family, a decree against which all human fortitude and prudence must struggle in vain. The orders of Mervan were mistaken, or disobeyed. The return of his horse, from which he had dismounted on a necessary occasion, impressed the belief of his death, and the enthusiasm of the black squadrons was ably conducted by Abdallah, the uncle of his competitor. After an irretrievable defeat, the caliph escaped to Mosul, but the colors of the Abbassides were displayed from the rampart. He suddenly repassed the Tigris, cast a melancholy look on his palace of Haran, crossed the Euphrates, abandoned the fortifications of Damascus, and, without halting in Palestine, pitched his last and fatal camp at Busir, on the banks of the Nile. His speed was urged by the incessant diligence of Abdallah, who in every step of the pursuit acquired strength and reputation. The remains of the white faction were finally vanquished in Egypt, and the lance which terminated the life and anxiety of Mervan was not less welcome perhaps to the unfortunate than to the victorious chief. The merciless inquisition of the conqueror eradicated the most distant branches of the hostile race. Their bones were scattered, their memory was accursed, and the martyrdom of Hossein was abundantly revenged on the posterity of his tyrants. Fourscore of the Ommiades, who had yielded to the faith or clemency of their foes, were invited to a banquet at Damascus. The laws of hospitality were violated by a promiscuous massacre. The board was spread over their fallen bodies, and the festivity of the guests was enlivened by the music of their dying groans. By the event of the civil war, the dynasty of the Abbassides was firmly established, but the Christians only could triumph in the mutual hatred and common loss of the disciples of Mahomet. Yet the thousands who were swept away by the sword of war might have been speedily retrieved in the succeeding generation, if the consequences of the revolution had not tended to dissolve the power and unity of the empire of the Saracens. In the proscription of the Ommiades, a royal youth of the name of Abdal Rahman alone escaped the rage of his enemies, who hunted the wandering exile from the banks of the Euphrates to the valleys of Mount Atlas. His presence in the neighborhood of Spain revived the zeal of the white faction. The name and cause of the Abbassides had been first vindicated by the Persians. The West had been pure from civil arms, and the servants of the abdicated family still held, by a precarious tenure, the inheritance of their lands and the offices of government. Strongly prompted by gratitude, indignation, and fear, they invited the grandson of the Caliph Hashem to ascend the throne of his ancestors, and, in his desperate condition, The extremes of rashness and prudence were almost the same. The acclamations of the people saluted his landing on the coast of Andalusia; and, after a successful struggle, Abdalrahman established the throne at Cordova, and was the father of the Ommiades of Spain, who reigned above 250 years from the Atlantic to the Pyrenees. He slew in battle a lieutenant of the Abbassides, who had invaded his dominions with a fleet and army. The head of Allah, in Sultan Kafire, was suspended by a daring messenger before the palace of Mecca, and the Caliph Almansor rejoiced in his safety, that he was removed by seas and lands from such a formidable adversary. Their mutual designs or declarations of offensive war evaporated without effect. But instead of opening a door to the conquest of Europe, Spain was dissevered from the trunk of the monarchy, engaged in perpetual hostility with the East, and inclined to peace and friendship with the Christian sovereigns of Constantinople and France. The example of the Ommiades was imitated by the real or fictitious progeny of Ali, the Edrisites of Mauritania, and the more powerful Fatimites of Africa and Egypt. In the tenth century the chair of Mahomet was disputed by three caliphs or commanders of the faithful, who reigned at Bagdad, Kairouan, and Cordova, excommunicating each other, and agreed only in a principle of discord, that a sectary is more odious and criminal than an unbeliever. Mecca was the patrimony of the line of Hashem, yet the Abbassides were never tempted to reside either in the birthplace or the city of the Prophet. Damascus was disgraced by the choice, and polluted with the blood, of the Ommiades; and, after some hesitation, Almansor, the brother and successor of Saffah, laid the foundations of Bagdad, the imperial seat of his posterity, during a reign of 500 years. The chosen spot is on the eastern bank of the Tigris, about 15 miles above the ruins of Modane. The double wall was of a circular form, and such was the rapid increase of a capital, now dwindled to a provincial town, that the funeral of a popular saint might be attended by 800,000 men and 60,000 women of Bagdad and the adjacent villages. In this city of peace, amidst the riches of the East, the Abbassides soon disdained the abstinence and frugality of the first caliphs, and aspired to emulate the magnificence of the Persian kings. After his wars and buildings, Almansor left behind him in gold and silver about 30 millions sterling, and this treasure was exhausted in a few years by the vices or virtues of his children. His son Mahdi, in a single pilgrimage to Mecca, expended 6 millions of dinars of gold. A pious and charitable motive may sanctify the foundation of cisterns and caravanserais, which he distributed along a measured road of 700 miles; but his train of camels laden with snow could serve only to astonish the natives of Arabia, and to refresh the fruits and liquors of the royal banquet. The courtiers would surely praise the liberality of his grandson Almamun, who gave away 4/5 of the income of a province, a sum of 2,400,000 gold dinars, before he drew his foot from the stirrup. At the nuptials of the same prince, 1,000 pearls of the largest size were showered on the head of the bride, and a lottery of lands and houses displayed the capricious bounty of fortune. The glories of the court were brightened rather than impaired in the decline of the empire, and a Greek ambassador might admire, or pity, the magnificence of the feeble Moqtadir. The caliph's whole army, says the historian Abdulfeda, both horse and foot, was under arms, which together made a body of 160,000 men. His state officers, the favorite slaves, stood near him in splendid apparel, their belts glittering with gold and gems. Near them were 7,000 eunuchs, 4,000 of them white, the remainder black. The porters, or doorkeepers, were in number 700. Barges and boats, with the most superb decorations, were seen swimming upon the Tigris. Nor was the palace itself less splendid, in which were hung up 38,000 pieces of tapestry, 12,500 of which were of silk embroidered with gold. The carpets on the floor were 22,000. 100 lions were brought out, with a keeper to each lion. Among the other spectacles of rare and stupendous luxury was a tree of gold and silver, spreading into 18 large branches, on which, and on the lesser boughs, sat a variety of birds made of the same precious metals, as well as the leaves of the tree. While the machinery affected spontaneous motions, the several birds warbled their natural harmony. Through this scene of magnificence the Greek ambassador was led by the vizier to the foot of the caliph's throne. In the west the Ommiades of Spain supported with equal pomp the title of Commander of the Faithful. 3 miles from Cordova, in honor of his favorite sultana, the third and greatest of the Abdal Rahmans, constructed the city, palace, and gardens of Zara. 25 years and about 3 millions sterling were employed by the founder. His liberal taste invited the artists of Constantinople, the most skilful sculptors and architects of the age, and the buildings were sustained or adorned by 1,200 columns of Spanish and African, of Greek and Italian marble. The hall of audience was encrusted with gold and pearls, and a great basin in the centre was surrounded with the curious and costly figures of birds and quadrupeds. In a lofty pavilion of the gardens, one of these basins and fountains, so delightful in a sultry climate, was replenished not with water, but with the purest quicksilver. The seraglio of Abdal Rahman, his wives, concubines, and black eunuchs, amounted to 6,300 persons, and he was attended to the field by a guard of 12,000 horse, whose belts and scimitars were studded with gold. Chapter 52 Part 2